Joining us now are Danya Perry, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, and Andrew Weissman, you may have heard of him, the former lead prosecutor for special counsel Robert Mueller and co-host of the must-listen-to MSNBC podcast, Prosecuting Donald Trump. Andrew, Danya, it's great to see you both in the flesh as this, well, I guess the prognostication continues about what's happening here. Andrew, let me start with you in terms of the presence of Will Russell testifying today. What does this tell you about where we are in the January 6th investigation?
Well, first, there's nothing unusual about somebody being called back into the grand jury. That can happen for a whole variety of reasons. It could happen because Jack Smith wants to actually see how he testifies and sort of get a sense of his credibility. It could be also they just learned something new that they want to ask him about. It also could be that they have some questions about things he might have said earlier that they are concerned about whether it's totally accurate. That might be a bit of a euphemism, and whether he now has his memory refreshed. It could be any of those things. It does suggest it's sort of a later stage. I mean, obviously, if you get a target letter, that's the key thing that tells you it's at this point where I think very much at the end stage. But to your point, he is the sort of natural person to make sure you've sort of gone through everything he knows, because he is there with the former president day in and day out. So in some ways, it's even better than Mark Meadows. Plus, he's sort of a more junior person. So you might, I stress, get a more candid version of what happened.
Well, right. I mean, it's like prosecuting a mob case. You start with the lower level people who don't have as much skin invested in the game that were in the room where it happened. Does it surprise you, Danya, that this is the first time we've really talked about William Russell? This is someone who was not apparently on the radar of the January 6th committee, but then you see the photos of him on January 6th, and he is in the place you need to be to find out Trump's state of mind in a critical moment in American history.
Yeah, to Andrew's point, it often is the kind of fly on the wall who makes the best witness for the prosecution. They know so much, they hear everything, but sometimes the higher-ups don't really notice their presence and are very candid while they're there. And they also don't usually have the same kind of culpability or exposure. And so they don't have to make deals, so they're not a complicated witness in that sense. So just like Cassidy Hutchinson in some way was a wonderful witness for the January 6th committee, and she put so much into the record that we hadn't known, this is kind of the analog in some way. And so it's not surprising that he'd be called time and time again. Perhaps, and we don't know, and I'm kind of answering a little bit or adding on to the question you put to Andrew, but it doesn't necessarily mean that much. It can be many reasons, as you said. It can be tricks of the calendar. It doesn't mean that they are or not indicting next week. They can continue to put people in the grand jury, as we've seen with the Mar-a-Lago investigation.
Yeah, well, also, I mean, to everybody's point, this is someone who has been testifying about multiple investigations here, Andrew. And I wonder, there's an anecdote, there's a story about what happened in court today. A judge in an unrelated case effectively forced William Russell's lawyer to give up a little bit of information about why William Russell was meeting with the grand jury today. Can you offer a little insight into that?
Sure. So essentially, Trevor McFadden was the judge, and the defense counsel for Mr. Russell was supposed to be present before Trevor McFadden for a sentencing of a different defendant who he also represented. And by the way, the same defense lawyer also represents Mr. Nauta, so that's three.
Yes.
And he was late, and that apparently displeased the judge. You shouldn't be late to a court appearance. And in the course of that, the defense counsel said, I had to go back, and it took longer because there was a claim of executive privilege.
So William Russell was testifying to this grand jury, and somehow it involves executive privilege.
Exactly. And then that all sort of got worked out behind the scenes because the prosecutors came and spoke with the judge, and we don't know that part because appropriately that was behind the scenes. I sort of took two things away from that. One is that happened sort of later in the day, and that sort of meant Mr. Russell was there for quite some time.
Oh,
and I think that's a good sign for the government that they were really pressing on a whole variety of issues. Again, tea leaf reading, but it's not somebody who went in for an hour to clean something up. So that suggests to me that there was a variety of topics that were being plumbed. The other issue is, as I mentioned, his counsel represents two other people. I'm not saying this with respect to this particular lawyer, but there is a problem in cases involving multiple people in a conspiracy, where you have something called house counsel, where the lawyer is making sure that they're kind of doing the bidding for the ultimate client.
Which in this case is?
Donald Trump. And also that tends to be also the person who's paying.
And he is.
Exactly. So you have sort of those two things going on. And that would be something, if I were the prosecutor, I would be concerned about. Now, just to be clear, it is legal to represent multiple people. Each person waives the potential conflict. But it is perilous because you, as a lawyer, have an ethical obligation to zealously represent each of your clients. And sometimes those clients' interests conflict. And then you have an ethical obligation to say, I can't do this. Does that always happen? No, unfortunately, it doesn't always happen. So that's the concern, is that you have somebody who's really not there representing that person's best interest.
Just as an onlooker to all this, when you see the name Stanley Woodward, which is the name of Mr. Russell's lawyer, it, to me, signals, oh, that means that the person he's representing ain't cooperating with the federal government. Listen to this list. Walt Nauta, the co-conspirator named in the Mar-a-Lago case. Tyler Budowich, who was the last witness called into the grand jury in Florida. Yusil Taveras, who is the Mar-a-Lago IT guy who was working alongside Walt Nauta, maybe on security camera questions. Dan Scavino, close Trump aide. Kash Patel and Peter Navarro. All of those people, Danya, are being represented by Stanley Woodward. Does this foreclose the possibility that any of them are going to ever cooperate with the federal government? And should we assume that none of those people are cooperating witnesses at this point?
It probably is a thumb on the scale against cooperation. As Andrew said, it can be consistent with ethical obligations. There's also no inherent problem with someone else paying legal bills. That happens all the time. Oftentimes, if a prosecutor raises this potential conflict, a judge will hold a hearing and determine for itself whether or not there is actually a conflict. And sometimes they will actually kick a lawyer off. So I haven't seen that happen in this case, but that's, there's some potential for that. But it's certainly, that is how people at the top keep the people at the bottom a little more in check.
Aligned. Well, yeah, they're all paid by the Trump Save America super PAC. I got to ask you, in terms of what William Russell might be brought in for in specific, Andrew. We talked about defrauding the electoral count. That was something that Pat Cipollone was worried about if Trump had gone to the Capitol on Jan 6th. Defrauding, that sort of dovetails with one of the charges that was outlined in the Target letter.
Absolutely.
Do you think that that's where we're going with this? I know I'm asking you to predict the sort of unpredictable, but is it off base to say, oh, maybe they're really zeroing in on that moment on January 6th where Trump's trying to physically go to the Capitol and encourage his supporters to go with him?
Well, I think there's no question that's at least one of the topics. There's this photograph, as you showed, of his being there. So if you are the prosecutors, you want to know everything from everybody as to what was going on with Donald Trump on that day. And so this is a logical person. And so I think that's included. But if it were me, I would also want to know, what do you know about pressuring Mike Pence? What do you know about pressuring DOJ? What do you know about pressuring the states? In other words, he may have information about all of those things. And even if it's just small pieces, you want to make sure you've plumbed that. He also could be a witness, as Cassidy Hutchinson is, as to knowledge before January 6th of potential violence. And it seems unusual if he did not know that, given just how much information we have about people being concerned about that.
Yeah.
We have Hope Hicks, who told the January 6th committee, and presumably has now told Jack Smith about her conversations with the president on January 4th and 5th, where she pleaded with him to say something to the crowd that's coming on January 6th about, you have to stay peaceful. And according to her, the president rejected that.
Danya, I do want to raise something that Barb McQuaid and I were talking about yesterday, which is the special counsel very much is still interviewing witnesses, both in this investigation and in Mar-a-Lago. And is there any risk in continuing to bring in witnesses and sort of stretching on the timetable in which indictments and superseding indictments could come, given the whole cold, hard reality of a presidential campaign that is very much underway and the sort of complications in and around that?
Yes, I would agree. There's some risk to that. And I think that the special counsel's office is keenly aware of that. And they are going to hold themselves, I think, to a very tight timetable here. So the grand jury doesn't have to be impaneled in order to supersede. They could still be gathering information. They could also be looking at other targets that maybe are on a longer time frame than Mr. Trump. So there are plenty for them to do. But so it doesn't necessarily put in jeopardy the time frame, of indicting this particular defendant before we really get into election season.
So Bernie Kerik and Rudy Giuliani don't breathe a sigh of relief just yet. The work is not over. Andrew Weissmann, Danya Perry, so great to have both of you here. Thanks for your time. I know I'm going to be seeing more of both of you soon.